I'm going to be reading tonight from this novel, which has recently come out, Right This Way. And I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning and a little bit from towards the middle. And I'll give you the context of it now. The protagonist of the novel is a slightly past middle-aged real estate agent from a small town in New Jersey. And he's been married to his high school sweetheart for these decades upon decades. But within recent memory, he had an affair with someone named Eleanor, which his wife found out about, as did many other people, which created much heartache. And also, for the purpose of this novel, much heartache, but also much comedy. While he's selling real estate, there's one of the women that he's trying to sell a house to is named Grace. And she's, as one person describes her later, a firecracker. And she's very emotionally labile. She'll burst into tears at the moment's notice. And she's also very interested in having a relationship with Cutter. And he's interested in not doing that, while at the same time, of course, he is interested in it. So he's trying to keep his wife happy and Eleanor happy and Grace happy and himself happy, and that's actually impossible. All of this having been set off and complicated by his having looked up and seen God's face in the sky. And when he saw God's face, it was in the shape of a terracotta garden ornament. And he keeps talking about that. And he's distressed because he thinks his wife would be much more interested in this if it weren't a cut rate vision. So that's what's going on. And because it's a small town, everybody hears about his having seen God's face. And Eleanor, who has been out of his way for some time, decides to come back and find out for herself what's been going on. So she kind of issues a command performance demand on him and has him meet her at Barnes and Noble. And so he heads out there one evening, and he's sitting at a table for two, pretending to read a guide, a travel guide, and waiting for her to show up. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happens. Instead, he hears a voice at his side, and it is instead Grace. So Grace sits down and is talking with him, and he checks his watch because he realizes that Eleanor will be showing up any moment. And of course, Grace, seeing that, gets pretty huffy. He wants to make it up to her because he doesn't like to hurt people. And besides that, he's hoping to sell her a house. No, said Cutter. It's nothing, a bad habit, this checking time. Really, it comes from wanting to be on time for appointments. Can't shake it. I'm babbling, he thought, and added, really, you're not keeping me. Not keeping me from anything. I've all the time in the world. Good, she said, lowering her voice in volume and pitch to a level of intimacy. I'm glad we met tonight. I was feeling lonely. Cutter looked over her shoulder. Eleanor was standing a few feet away, holding a cup. Back had been turned towards the counter, and he hadn't seen her before. Now, having caught his eye, she headed towards their table. Eleanor put her cup on the table, right in the middle, smiled, and held her right hand out to Grace. Eleanor Levy, she said. Grace Cooper, Grace said, reaching up to shake her hand. The gold bangles slid down her arm. Noisy, Eli thought. Eleanor looked around. Oh dear, all the tables are taken. Cutter glanced at the tables nearby. All the four tops had one or two people sitting at them already, just as well. It gets so crowded in here, Eleanor continued. Yes, Grace murmured, and took a sip of her cappuccino. I hate sitting with strangers, Eleanor said. It's not that I'm shy. I just feel it's such an imposition. Eli listened and watched closely. Cobra and mongoose. Eleanor was speaking with italics. That's not like her. Well, this must be awkward for her, too. Eleanor had put her cup in the middle of the table. She's not leaving. What can you do? Grace said. She shrugged, then beamed at Eli. I was so lucky to run into Eli. He's such good company. He'd made a mistake telling Grace he had plenty of time. If Eleanor left him with Grace, he'd get home so late that he'd need a fancy excuse. I'd ask to pull over a chair and join you two, Eleanor said, but I don't want to intrude. Her cup on the table said something else. She's good, Cutter told himself. There's no possible response to that but to say something like, oh, not at all, you're not intruding. He could say it, but it would be better coming from Grace. He had to speak up soon. His silence would be a tacit agreement to her assessment of the intrusion. Grace was silent, smiling but silent. So Cutter rose. Please do, he said, embarrassed that he's unintentionally acknowledged Eleanor's arrival to be an intrusion. I'll pull a chair over and sit here, he said, gesturing at the third side of the tiny table. There's plenty of room. Don't you want some coffee, Eli? As long as we'll all be here, Grace said. Cutter shook his head. Oh, do, Eli, Eleanor said. I hate drinking alone. She laughed, having just annihilated Grace. Cutter looked at the two women, appalled at the way they were colluding to get him to go for coffee. Crap, he thought. The second I leave this table, they start talking. If they were Cobra and Mongoose, what was he? So that's the first section that I want to read. It gives an idea of some of the shenanigans that go on and how he attempts to escape unscathed as much as possible. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, he and Grace get a lot closer in all ways, including physically, but he's still violently trying to remain what you might call chaste. He's now at her house in the morning after one of their late nights together, and she offers him coffee. But then, because she doesn't remember what he puts in his coffee, whether he takes it with cream or sugar or black, she begins to cry because she's so used to being able to know what her husband wants. So she's standing there, tears running down her cheeks, and he realizes he ought to console her, but he also knows that to do so would be a disaster. So instead, he follows her suggestion and he has the iced espresso, and he's sitting on one of those tall chairs that you have in kitchens where there are breakfast bars. He's on one of these tall chairs, and they're having this discussion when she says that she's ruining everything. Ruining everything? Of course you're not. Tears and divorce went together. He'd seen them before, but Grace was different, less restrained. She needed medication or therapy or friends. Didn't she have any lady friends? What did she mean anyway, ruining everything? No, She stopped short. Cutter knew that he was supposed to ask her to finish her sentence. She wouldn't, and then the script called for him to urge her to confide in him, to feel safe with him. But he wasn't following that script. He'd wait her out. With luck, in a few minutes she'll have calmed herself down, and they'll be on their way to see the first house on today's list. "Oh, Eli," she cried, and she flung herself against him. The front legs of Cutter's chair left the floor. He threw his hands into the air, which further shifted his weight back, so he tilted. His chair went over backwards, carrying him to the floor and Grace with him. As his body arced towards the ceramic tile, he had time only to think, "Please, God," without completing the bargain in exchange for his safety. The rest was wordless. He closed his eyes as he went backwards, flashed on the image of the face he'd seen in the sky, heard the splintering wood, and Grace's wail. And then there he was on the floor, Grace on top of him. He'd never liked these tall chairs. He'd been holding the glass of ice cubes and the murky brown water that the espresso had become after the ice melted. When his hands had gone up, the coffee had splashed out onto his shirt. When he'd fallen, he'd lost his grip on the glass, which flew up, landed on the tile floor, and shattered. Now he and Grace lay on the floor and on what was left of the chair. Shards of glass and melting ice cubes were scattered on the white tile floor. Cutter became aware that his arms were around Grace, whose head was on his chest, her hands on his shoulders, as if she'd collapsed on him after making love. He turned his head to one side, relieved that he could move without excruciating pain. The shards and the splinters and slivers of glass sparkled with innumerable rainbows in the sun. He barely had time to get his bearings when a series of unmistakable chimes gave notice. Someone at the front door. Eli left his arms where they were, his hands on Grace's back. Grace spoke into his chest. She lifted and turned her head, still muttering, "Fuck, fuck, fuck." The doorbell rang again, then a familiar woman's voice called out from the living room. "Hello? Anyone home? Hello?" And then, softer, talking to someone with her. "I like to make sure that the owners know that come here if they're home. I don't want to startle them." And then laughter, a man and a woman, and then again, a musical, "Hello?" Cutter lay still. Grace started to giggle. Putting her head back down. Her laughter grew louder as the voices came closer. Someone had used the key from the lockbox to let herself in, to show the house. "Hello?" she called again. Cutter lifted his hands from Grace's back, and he held his hands up in the air as though he were being robbed or surrendering to the law. Nothing to do for it now. Grace should say something. And when she laughed instead, of course they'd heard. How could they not? He answered himself, "We're in the kitchen," which was literally true. "Eli Cutter," the woman said. The woman who's speaking is Joanne. Joanne is the woman who is selling Grace's house for her. She has to sell the house to buy a house. However, being a small town, Joanne is a cousin of Lynn's best friend, so that everything creates a circle. Even from this bizarre angle, he recognized Joanne, who was married to Ruth's cousin. She was one of the part-time saleswomen who did this for what they call pin money. 20,000 here, 20,000 there. Pin money, they called it. "Good grief," she said. "Hello, Joanne." Carter felt acute embarrassment. Grace, whose laughter had subsided, was now laughing again, moving towards hysteria. Perhaps hysteria was a normal state for her. "We've had a little accident," he said, chiding himself for saying something so obvious. He shouldn't be so hard on himself. After all, he wasn't at his best right now. Are you all right? The man, whoever he was, walked over too and stooped down next to Cutter. Glass crunched under his soles as he moved. You're walking through broken glass, Chet, a woman said. Cutter couldn't see her from where he was lying. We'll track it all over the house. Oh, right, Chet said, and absently. He looked at Cutter, and the two men exchanged sympathetic looks. We'd better get that glass up so that you can move, Joanne said, and added perfunctory introduction of the couple that she had just had in tow. Cutter had never liked Joanne or her big hair. Now he thought she was enjoying the scene too much, especially his discomfort and embarrassment. Her voice fairly oozed assumed professionalism and phony concern. I see that I don't have to make introductions, Grace said. She put her palms on his chest and rested her chin on them. Joanne stood directly behind Cutter's head, so Grace would be staring at her shins or ankles. A young woman handed Chet a wad of paper towels, and he dabbed at the floor around them. This will pick up the glass and not scatter it around, so you can get up without cutting yourself. It won't take long. Then the young man asked, You can get up, can't you? You are all right, aren't you? Oh, yes, Cutter said. Never been better under the circumstance. And these two scenes are typical of the sorts of things that happen to Cutter. And I say happen to because although he controls things, he also sees himself as receiving many of these actions. As the novel progresses, Grace gets bolder, he gets braver, and then things happen. I'll put it like that. I don't want to give away the end of the novel. I can just say that I knew how I wanted it to end, and then I couldn't get the characters to do that. They just refused. They just absolutely refused. So I let them do what they wanted, and I'll leave it to you to read and see that. Thank you for your attention.